The drought had lasted 43 days. Wade Mercer knew because he'd marked each one in the ledger he kept inside the barn, right next to the columns tracking feed costs and cattle weights and all the other numbers that proved his ranch still existed, even when some mornings he wasn't entirely sure he did. 43 days without rain meant the creek ran shallow enough to see stones that normally stayed hidden. It meant dust devils dancing across the grazing fields every afternoon. It meant Wade spent an extra hour each evening hauling water from the well to supplement what the cattle couldn't get naturally, his shoulders burning, his hands blistered, his mind carefully empty of anything except the next task. That was how Wade survived the 3 years since Margaret died. One task, then another, never stopped long enough to feel anything. The ranch sat 8 miles outside Blackthorn Ridge, far enough that Wade could go weeks without seeing another human face if he planned carefully. The house was small but solid. Margaret had insisted on real glass windows instead of oiled paper, back when they'd first built the place together, back when Wade still believed planning for the future meant something. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as a sitting room, a porch that faced west toward mountains. He used to think were beautiful before they became just another feature of a landscape he'd stopped noticing. Caleb was 6 years old and looked exactly like his mother. Same dark hair that never laid flat, no matter how much water you used. Same serious gray eyes that watched everything twice as long as other children did. Same way of going completely silent when he was thinking hard about something, like words were too slow for whatever was happening inside his head. Wade loved his son the way you loved something that hurt to look at directly. Every time Caleb smiled, which wasn't often anymore, Wade saw Margaret smile. Every time the boy asked a question in that careful, thoughtful way of his, Wade heard Margaret's voice. It made him want to pull Caleb close, and also made him want to ride out to the far pasture and not come back until dark, until he'd worked himself too exhausted to feel the ache of all that accidental resemblance. So Wade kept himself busy. He fixed fences that didn't need fixing. He rode property lines that hadn't shifted. He invented tasks that filled hours and required just enough attention that thoughts couldn't intrude, and by the time he collapsed into bed each night, his body was too tired to dream, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But Caleb was starting to notice. "You ever going to talk again?" the boy asked one morning while Wade was checking the cattle in the south pasture. Wade glanced over, surprised. "I talk." "Not really." Caleb was sitting on the fence rail, bare feet swinging, watching his father with that unnervingly direct stare children used before they learned to hide what they were thinking. "You say stuff like, 'eat your breakfast,' or 'finish your chores,' but you don't actually talk. Mama used to talk." The comment landed like a fist to the sternum. Wade opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I talk," he repeated, which even to his own ears sounded pathetic. Caleb shrugged and went back to watching the cattle, and Wade felt something ugly twist in his chest, shame maybe, or guilt, or just the exhausted recognition that he was failing at something important but didn't have enough left inside him to figure out what. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, they needed supplies. Wade hated going into town, hated the way people looked at him with that careful mix of pity and discomfort, like grief was contagious if you acknowledged it directly. Hated the questions disguised as concern. "How you holding up?" and "That boy doing all right?" And the worst one, always delivered with a sympathetic head tilt. "You need anything?" What Wade needed was for Margaret to not be dead. What Wade needed was to stop waking up every morning surprised all over again that she wasn't in bed next to him. What Wade needed was for time to move faster or slower or just different, because 3 years felt both like forever and like yesterday, and he couldn't reconcile how those two things were simultaneously true. But you couldn't say that to people. So Wade said, "We're managing," and changed the subject as fast as possible and counted the minutes until he could leave. Blackthorn Ridge wasn't much of a town, maybe 300 people if you included the outlying ranches. One main street with a general store, a land office, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a church that doubled as a school, and a trading post where you could sell hides or buy ammunition or arrange for someone to shoe your horse. Most of the buildings were sun-bleached wood that had gone gray over the years, and the whole place smelled like dust and horses and the particular sourness of too many people living too close together without enough water. Wade tied his horse outside the general store and told Caleb to stay close. The boy nodded but immediately wandered toward the trading post, drawn by something in the window display, probably the pocket knives old Hanson kept on the counter to tempt young customers. Wade watched him go, felt the familiar spike of anxiety about letting Caleb out of sight even for 30 seconds, then forced himself to turn away and go inside. The store was dim and cool after the brutal afternoon heat. Rows of dry goods lined the shelves: flour, cornmeal, coffee, salt, sugar, beans. In the back corner, bolts of fabric sat stacked next to spools of thread and cards of buttons, remnants from when Blackthorn Ridge had optimistically believed it might become the kind of town where women threw quilting parties and worried about curtain patterns. Wade Mercer. The voice came from behind the counter, flat and unsurprised. Wondered when you'd show up. Tom Bellamy ran the store with his wife, Ruth. He was 50-something, balding, with the kind of face that looked perpetually suspicious even when he was being friendly. Wade didn't particularly like him, but Tom kept fair prices and didn't ask invasive questions, which made him tolerable. "Need the usual," Wade said, "plus extra cornmeal if you got it." Tom nodded and started pulling items from the shelves. "Heard Vernon Pike's organizing a group to drive cattle up to Fort Rollins come September. You thinking about joining?" "No." "Might be worth considering, safety and numbers and all that." Tom set a 20-pound sack of flour on the counter. "Could use someone who knows the northern routes." Wade had driven cattle to Fort Rollins 4 times before Margaret got sick, back when he'd still cared about expanding the ranch, about building something that would last. Now the thought of spending 3 weeks on the trail with Vernon Pike and his crew made Wade's jaw ache from clenching. "I'll pass," he said. Tom gave him a look that suggested he thought Wade was being stubborn and stupid, but wasn't going to argue about it. He finished gathering supplies: coffee, beans, salt, cornmeal, a small bag of peppermints Caleb liked, and tallied the cost. Wade paid and was loading the items into his saddlebag when he noticed Caleb wasn't where he'd left him. The spike of anxiety returned, sharper this time. Wade scanned the street quickly. The boy wasn't by the trading post anymore, wasn't near the saloon, wasn't by the water trough where some kids were splashing each other despite their mothers yelling at them to stop wasting water during a drought. Then he spotted him. Caleb was standing in front of the trading post, but he wasn't looking at pocket knives anymore. He was staring at a woman sitting alone on the bench outside, partially hidden in the shadow of the building's overhang. Wade's first thought was that she looked tired. His second thought was that tired wasn't strong enough. She looked like someone who'd been tired for so long she'd forgotten what rested felt like. She wore a faded green dress that had been carefully mended at the sleeves and hem, the kind of repairs that took time and skill but couldn't hide the fact that the fabric was worn thin in places. Her hair was pinned up in a style that might have been fashionable 5 years ago, but now just looked dated, and her hands rested in her lap in a way that suggested she was forcing herself to sit still when what she really wanted to do was disappear. Most people walked past her without looking. Blackthorn Ridge was good at not seeing things it didn't want to acknowledge. But Caleb was staring at her with that unblinking intensity children used before they learned that some truths weren't supposed to be spoken aloud. And Wade felt a cold sense of dread because he knew, absolutely knew, his son was about to say something that would make this situation complicated. "You look lonely." The woman's head snapped up like she'd been slapped. Wade moved fast, grabbing Caleb's shoulder maybe harder than he should have. "Sorry," he said quickly, directing the apology somewhere between the woman and the middle distance. "He doesn't mean kids say things. It's all right." Her voice was quiet, careful, the kind of voice people used when they were trying very hard not to take up too much space. She looked at Caleb instead of Wade, and something in her expression shifted, surprise maybe, or recognition. "He's honest. That's not a bad thing." Caleb twisted to look up at Wade. "But she does look lonely." "Caleb." Wade's voice came out sharper than he intended. "We need to go." The woman stood quickly, brushing at her skirt even though there was no dust on it. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't cause—" Wade stopped himself, acutely aware that they were drawing attention now. Several people had paused to watch, and Tom Bellamy had come to stand in the doorway of the general store, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Wade took a breath, forced his shoulders to relax, gave the woman a stiff nod that was supposed to communicate apology and dismissal simultaneously. Then he steered Caleb toward their horse, loaded the saddlebags with more force than necessary, and lifted his son into the saddle. They were 2 blocks out of town before Caleb spoke again. "Why'd we leave so fast?" Wade didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the woman's face, the way she'd looked both grateful that someone had acknowledged her existence and terrified of that same acknowledgement. He was thinking about Tom Bellamy's crossed arms, about the way conversations had stopped when Caleb spoke to her. "You can't just say things like that to strangers," Wade said finally. "Why not?" "Because people don't like it." But it was true. Caleb shifted in the saddle, trying to turn around to see his father's face. She was lonely, I could tell. Wade felt something tighten in his chest. "That doesn't mean you should say it. Mama always said telling the truth was important." "Your mama." Wade stopped himself hard, took another breath, started over. "Your mama was right about a lot of things, but sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable, and you need to learn when to keep it to yourself." Caleb went quiet after that, and Wade hated himself for it. Hated that he was teaching his son to hide honesty behind polite silence, to ignore suffering because acknowledging it was inconvenient, to follow the unspoken rules of a town that measured a man's worth by how well he minded his own business. Hated that he was turning Caleb into another version of himself. But what was the alternative? They rode home in silence, the afternoon heat pressing down like a physical weight, and Wade tried very hard not to think about the woman's face or the way she'd said, "I didn't mean to cause trouble," like causing trouble was something she'd spent her entire life trying to avoid. He tried. He failed. That night, Wade couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and creak around him, thinking about things he'd deliberately stopped thinking about 3 years ago. Margaret would have helped that woman. The thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome, and absolutely true. Margaret would have marched right up to that bench, sat down next to her, and struck up a conversation like it was the most natural thing in the world. She would have learned the woman's name and her story, and probably would have invited her out to the ranch for Sunday dinner within 10 minutes. That was who Margaret had been, someone who saw suffering and moved toward it instead of away from it, who believed people were supposed to help each other even when it was inconvenient or complicated or socially awkward. Wade had loved that about her. Had also found it exhausting sometimes, if he was being honest. She'd brought home strays, both animal and human, with alarming regularity. A widow who'd lost her homestead to debt. A drifter with a broken leg who'd needed somewhere to recover. A Mexican family escaping violence across the border who'd camped on their property for 2 months while figuring out where to go next. Wade had never turned anyone away, but he'd also never initiated that kind of help himself. That was Margaret's territory. She had the instinct for it, the ease with it. Wade just followed her lead and tried not to complain about the extra mouths to feed or the complications of explaining to neighbors why they were housing people most folks considered undesirable. After she died, he'd stopped, partly because he didn't have the energy for it, partly because extending that kind of help required emotional availability he didn't possess anymore, but mostly because doing it without Margaret felt like pretending to be someone he wasn't. Now, lying in the dark, Wade wondered if that was cowardice disguised as grief. Wondered if he'd been using Margaret's death as an excuse to become smaller, more isolated, more selfish. Wondered what she would think of the man he'd become in her absence. He didn't like any of the answers his mind offered. 3 days later, Wade went back to town. He told himself it was because they needed nails, which was technically true, although not urgent. He told himself it had nothing to do with the woman on the bench, or Caleb's comment, or the guilt that had been gnawing at him since Friday. He told himself a lot of things he didn't quite believe. Caleb came with him again, sitting in front of Wade on the saddle, unusually quiet. The boy had been subdued since their last trip, and Wade didn't know if that was because of the reprimand or something else entirely, but either way it sat heavy in his chest. They reached town mid-morning when the heat was building, but not yet unbearable. Wade tied up outside the general store again, but this time he found himself scanning the street before going inside. She wasn't there. The bench outside this trading post was empty. Wade felt an odd mix of relief and disappointment, then felt stupid for feeling anything at all. He went into the store, bought the nails he didn't urgently need, exchanged minimal small talk with Tom Bellamy, and was heading back outside when he heard raised voices from the direction of the saloon. 2 men stood in the doorway, ranch hands by the look of them, dusty and sunburned and already half drunk despite the early hour. They were laughing at something, loud and mean, and it took Wade a moment to realize they were laughing at someone. The woman from last week. She was walking past the saloon, eyes fixed straight ahead, trying to ignore them. One of the men called after her, something crude Wade couldn't quite hear but could guess from the tone, and she walked faster. Wade's hands curled into fists. This wasn't his business. He knew that. Getting involved would create exactly the kind of scene and complication he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Those men worked for Vernon Pike, and Pike wasn't someone you crossed lightly. Wade's best move was to collect Caleb, get on his horse, and ride home. He knew all of that. He started walking toward the saloon anyway. "Hey," his voice came out flat and cold. "Leave her alone." The two men turned, surprised. The taller one, a kid maybe 20 years old with a patchy beard and mean eyes, grinned slowly. "Well, hell, Wade Mercer. Didn't know you cared about whores." Wade's vision went narrow and hot. "Say that again." The kid's grin widened. "I said, Rusty." The second man grabbed his friend's arm, suddenly looking a lot more sober. "Come on, not worth it." But Rusty was young and drunk and stupid, and he shook off his friend's grip. "What are you going to do, Mercer? You've been hiding on that ranch so long I figured you forgot how to—" Wade hit him. It wasn't a particularly good punch. He was out of practice, and his knuckles connected wrong, pain flaring through his hand. But it was enough to send Rusty stumbling backward into the saloon doorway, blood streaming from his nose, shock replacing the mean grin. His friend swore and reached for something, knife or gun, Wade couldn't tell. But suddenly Tom Bellamy was there, shotgun in hand, voice carrying across the street with surprising authority. "That's enough, all of you." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Rusty's friend grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into the saloon, muttering threats that didn't quite rise to actionable. Tom kept the shotgun leveled until they disappeared, then turned to Wade with an expression somewhere between exasperated and resigned. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Wade's hand was throbbing. He could feel people staring from windows and doorways, could already hear the gossip spreading like brush fire. Wade Mercer started a fight over that widow woman. This was going to be a problem. "Nothing," Wade said. "Just a misunderstanding." Tom snorted. "That's a hell of a misunderstanding." He lowered the shotgun but didn't put it away. "Get out of here, Wade, before this gets worse." Wade nodded and turned to find Caleb, who'd watched the entire thing from beside their horse, eyes huge. But before he could take 2 steps, he heard a quiet voice behind him. "You didn't have to do that." The woman stood there, arms wrapped around herself despite the heat, looking simultaneously grateful and mortified. Up close, Wade could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe late 20s, with brown eyes that had seen too much and a face that might have been pretty before life wore it down. "Yeah," Wade said. "I did." "Now they'll just be worse." She was probably right. Rusty would nurse his wounded pride with alcohol and retell the story until Wade became the villain, and she became something even less respectable than she already was in the town's estimation. By tomorrow, half of Blackthorn Ridge would believe she'd asked for Wade's protection in exchange for something inappropriate, and the other half would just think Wade had lost his mind. "Let them," Wade said. She stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "You don't understand how this town works." "I've lived here 15 years. I understand fine." "Then you know—" She stopped herself, glanced around at the people still watching from windows, and lowered her voice. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." Wade's hand was really throbbing now, knuckles already swelling. He was exhausted and angry, and his son had just watched him start a fight in the middle of the street, and this woman was right, but that somehow made everything worse. "My name's Wade Mercer," he said abruptly. "I have a ranch 8 miles north. I need help with housework, bookkeeping, cooking. Pays fair, room and board included." Her eyes went wide. "What?" "Think about it." Wade was already moving toward his horse, toward Caleb, toward escape from this entire mortifying situation. "If you're interested, come by the ranch. Anyone can give you directions." Then he lifted Caleb into the saddle, climbed up behind him, and rode out of town before his brain could catch up with what his mouth had just done. They were a mile out before Caleb spoke. "Are you going to marry her?" Wade nearly fell off the horse. "What? No. Where did— No. But you invited her to live with us. To work. That's different." "Oh." Caleb sounded disappointed. Then after a pause. Mama would have liked her. The comment hit harder than Rusty's punch would have if it had connected. Wade didn't answer, didn't trust himself to answer. Just kept writing while his knuckles throbbed and his mind spun through all the ways he'd just complicated his deliberately uncomplicated life, and tried very hard not to think about whether Margaret really would have liked that woman, or whether his son had just accidentally voiced the exact thought that had driven Wade to make such a reckless offer in the first place. 5 days passed. Wade told himself she wouldn't come. The offer had been stupid, impulsive, the kind of thing you said in the heat of the moment and then regretted when you had time to think clearly. She was a stranger. He knew nothing about her except that she was a widow and the town treated her like dirt. For all he knew, she couldn't cook, couldn't keep books, couldn't do any of the things he'd theoretically hired her for. And even if she could, bringing an unrelated woman to live on his ranch was going to create exactly the kind of scandal he'd spent 3 years avoiding. So yeah, she definitely wouldn't come. Except on the 5th day, as Wade was fixing a section of fence in the south pasture, Caleb came running across the field yelling something Wade couldn't make out until the boy got closer. "There's a lady at the house!" Wade's stomach dropped. "What?" "A lady! She says you told her to come." Wade dropped the post-hole digger and started walking toward the house, Caleb running circles around him, chattering excitedly about how she had a small bag and worn-out boots, and had asked very politely if Mr. Mercer was home. Sure enough, when Wade came around the side of the barn, there she was, standing in front of the house like she wasn't sure if she should knock or run away, small canvas bag at her feet, that same faded green dress. Now he realized it might be her only dress, carefully brushed clean of travel dust. She turned when she heard Wade approach, and her expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested she'd practiced it. "Mr. Mercer." Wade. He stopped several feet away, suddenly acutely aware of how he must look, sweaty, dirty, beard probably full of dust. It's just Wade. Clara Whitmore. She didn't offer her hand, which was probably smart since his were filthy. "I thought about your offer. If it's still available, I'd like to accept." Wade's brain seemed to have stopped working. "You sure?" "No." The honesty surprised him. "But I don't have better options, and you didn't seem like—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "You seemed sincere." He didn't know what to say to that. Caleb, who'd been hanging back uncertainly, suddenly stepped forward. "I'm Caleb. I'm 6. Do you like rocks? I found a really good one yesterday. It's got sparkles in it." Clara's entire expression shifted, softening into something that looked like it might have been a smile before life taught her to be more careful with those. "I do like rocks. I'd love to see it." Caleb beamed and immediately ran toward the house, presumably to retrieve his treasure. Clara watched him go, then turned back to Wade. "He's your son." "Yeah." "He's the one who spoke to me, outside the trading post." "Yeah." A longer pause. Then, "Thank you for what you did at the saloon." Wade shifted uncomfortably. "Wasn't a big thing. It was to me." They stood there for a moment, two people who didn't know each other trying to figure out if they'd just made a terrible mistake or something that might resemble a good decision. Finally, Wade cleared his throat. "So, you know how to cook?" "Yes." "Keep books?" "I can learn. Clean, mend clothes, that kind of thing?" "Yes." Wade nodded slowly. "Pays $15 a month, plus room and board. Sundays off. You want to leave, you give a week's notice, and I'll pay you through the end of the month regardless. Fair?" "More than fair?" "All right then." He gestured toward the house. "I'll show you around." The house was small and cluttered in the way of places where people lived but didn't really maintain. Dishes stacked in the basin, dust on surfaces that should have been wiped down, laundry piled in a corner waiting to be washed. Wade felt a flash of embarrassment seeing it through a stranger's eyes. "It's a mess," he said. "We've been managing, but it's fine." Clara set her bag down carefully. "I've seen worse." The spare room was barely big enough for a bed and a small dresser, but it had a window and a door that closed, and when Clara saw it, her shoulders relaxed slightly, like privacy was a luxury she hadn't expected. "This is yours," Wade said. "I'll respect the closed door. So will Caleb." She looked at him sharply, like she was trying to determine if that statement had additional meaning. Wade kept his expression neutral and honest, letting her see that he meant exactly what he said and nothing more. After a moment, she nodded. Thank you. Caleb burst in then, holding a rock that was indeed sparkly, probably mica-flecked granite, and launching into an elaborate explanation of where he'd found it and why it was special, and did she want to see his other rocks because he had 17 of them, and they were all different. Clara sat down on the floor, right there on the dusty floor, in her only dress, and listened to Caleb's entire presentation with the kind of attention Wade hadn't seen anyone give his son in years. And watching Caleb's face light up, and Clara's careful guardedness start to crack slightly, Wade felt something shift in his chest. Not happiness, exactly. More like the absence of numbness. Like maybe, possibly, accidentally, he'd done something that wasn't just survival. He left them to it and went back to the fence line, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence of the ranch felt different. Less like isolation, more like possibility. And Wade didn't know yet if that was a good thing or terrifying thing or both simultaneously, but either way, there was no taking it back now. Clara Whitmore had arrived, and nothing at the Mercer ranch was going to stay the same. The first week felt like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. She woke before dawn, made breakfast without being asked, cleaned dishes so quietly Wade sometimes didn't realize she'd finished until he came inside and found everything put away. She kept her door closed when she wasn't working, spoke only when spoken to, and maintained a careful distance that made it clear she understood exactly how precarious her situation was. Wade paid her at the end of the first week, counting out the bills twice to make sure he got it right. And when he handed them to her, she stared at the money like she didn't quite believe it was real. "This is too much," she said. "That's what we agreed on." "You said 15 a month. This is first week plus a little extra for supplies. You needed a second dress." She looked up sharply, and Wade saw something flash across her face. Pride, maybe, or shame at having her poverty acknowledged so directly. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. You can't work in the same dress every day. It's practical." They stared at each other for a moment, neither backing down, and Wade realized this was some kind of test. Clara was trying to figure out what kind of man he was, whether his help came with strings attached, whether she'd have to fight him on every small kindness, or if he meant what he said about fair employment. Finally, she folded the money carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you." Wade nodded and escaped to the barn before the conversation could get more uncomfortable. Caleb, meanwhile, had decided Clara was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in his entire life. He followed her everywhere, chattering constantly in that way children did when they'd been starved for attention and suddenly found someone willing to listen. He showed her every rock in his collection, then every interesting stick, then every place on the ranch where something notable had happened. This was where he'd seen a coyote once. This was where his mother had planted wildflowers that still came up every spring. This was where he'd fallen out of a tree and broken his arm when he was 4. Clara listened to all of it with a patience Wade couldn't fathom. She asked questions that proved she was actually paying attention, not just pretending. She remembered details Caleb had mentioned days earlier and brought them up again. She took his interest seriously in a way that made the boy glow with the kind of happiness Wade had almost forgotten was possible. And watching them together made Wade feel things he'd been trying very hard not to feel. Guilt, mostly. His son had been lonely. Not just quiet or well-behaved, but actually lonely in a deep way. Wade had either missed entirely or chosen not to see, because seeing it would have required him to do something about it. Caleb had spent 3 years in a house with a father who was physically present but emotionally absent, and the boy had just accepted it because children accepted whatever their parents gave them and assumed it was normal. Now Clara was here, and Caleb was different, lighter, more himself maybe, or more the version of himself he would have been if Margaret hadn't died, and that made Wade feel like he'd been failing his son in ways he couldn't even properly articulate. The second week, Clara started cooking real meals. Not just beans and cornbread, which was what Wade had been surviving on for years, but actual food with multiple components that required planning. Roasted chicken with herbs she'd found growing wild near the creek, biscuits that weren't dense as rocks, vegetables that had been cooked in ways that made them taste like something other than punishment. Wade ate dinner the third night and had to stop himself from saying something embarrassing about how he'd forgotten food could taste like this. "This is really good," Caleb said, because children hadn't learned to hide genuine reactions yet. Papa never cooks like this. Clara glanced at Wade, something careful in her expression. Your father's been managing on his own. That's not easy. He makes everything too salty. Caleb, Wade said, but you do. Remember when you made that stew and it was so salty we had to give it to the chickens? Clara made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Wade felt his face heat. The chickens seemed to like it, he muttered. The chickens ate it because chickens will eat anything, Caleb said with brutal 6-year-old honesty. One time, I saw a chicken eat a nail. This time Clara did laugh, quick and surprised, and the sound of it did something strange to the air in the room, made it feel less heavy, maybe. Less like 3 separate people occupying the same space, and more like something that resembled a household. Wade cleared his throat and focused very intently on his plate. After dinner, Clara washed dishes while Caleb pestered her with questions about whether she knew how to whistle and if she'd ever seen an actual buffalo, and did she think dogs dreamed. Wade sat on the porch and listened to their voices filtering through the open window, and part of him wanted to go inside and be part of whatever was happening in there, and another part of him was terrified of disrupting it. So he stayed outside and smoked a cigarette he didn't particularly want, and tried not to think about how his house had started to feel less like a place he was just surviving in. The 3rd week, people in town noticed. Wade had known they would. Blackthorn Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and a widowed rancher hiring a widowed woman to live on his property was exactly the sort of scandal people loved to speculate about. He heard about it from Tom Bellamy first. Wade had gone into town for supplies, and Tom pulled him aside with that expression people wore when they were about to deliver unwelcome news disguised as helpful concern. People are talking, Tom said quietly. Wade set the bag of flour down harder than necessary. People always talk. This is different. Vernon Pike's been making noise about how you're setting a bad example, bringing that woman into your home without any kind of proper arrangement. What proper arrangement? Wade's voice came out flat. She's an employee. I pay her wages. She has her own room. I know that. You know that. Tom glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. But Pike's got people believing you've taken up with her in some inappropriate way, and now he's using it to undermine you. Wade felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why would Pike care about my household arrangements? Tom gave him a look that suggested Wade was being deliberately obtuse. Because you embarrassed one of his men in front of the whole town, and Pike doesn't forget that kind of thing. He's been looking for ways to make you pay for it, and this, he gestured vaguely, this is convenient for him. Wade had suspected this would become a problem, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. What's he doing? Spreading rumors mostly, suggesting the woman's, that she's not respectable, implying you're taking advantage of her situation, getting the church ladies worked up about moral standards and the example you're setting for your boy. That's horseshit. Doesn't matter if it's true. Matters if people believe it. Tom picked at a splinter on the counter. Look, I'm not telling you what to do, but you should know what you're up against. Pike's got influence, and if he decides to make this a real problem for you... He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Wade understood the implication just fine. He bought his supplies in silence, loaded them onto his horse, and rode home with a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there that morning. Clara was hanging laundry when he arrived, and she took one look at his face and went still. What happened? Wade dismounted and started unloading the saddlebags with more force than necessary. Nothing. That's not true. It's town gossip, not worth discussing. Clara finished pinning a shirt to the line, then turned to face him directly. It's about me, isn't it? Wade stopped moving, looked at her, saw that she already knew, had probably known from the moment she accepted his offer that this was coming. People talk, he said. Doesn't mean anything. It means plenty if it affects your reputation. Clara's voice was calm, but her hands twisted together in front of her, betraying the anxiety underneath. I told you this would happen. I can leave. No. The word came out harder than he intended. Clara blinked. Wade, no, he repeated, forcing his voice to sound more reasonable. You haven't done anything wrong. Neither have I. If people want to believe something ugly about an honest arrangement, that's their problem, not ours. That's not how this works. Clara's calm was cracking now, frustration bleeding through. You have a life here, a son to raise. Business relationships that matter. I'm nobody. I can find work somewhere else. Where? Wade demanded. Where are you going to find work? Every town within 100 miles operates the same way this one does. You think you'll be treated better somewhere else? Clara opened her mouth, closed it, and Wade saw the exact moment she realized he was right. She had no better options. No family to take her in, no money to start over, no skills valuable enough that another town would overlook her status as an unattached woman with no male relatives to vouch for her respectability. She was trapped, and Wade's offer had been the closest thing to a lifeline she was going to get. And now he was telling her that lifeline came with social consequences neither of them had fully anticipated. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have known better than to accept. Should have realized what it would do to you." Wade felt something break loose in his chest. "Stop apologizing for existing." She looked up, startled. "Everyone in this town acts like you're the problem," Wade continued, words tumbling out faster than he could organize them. "Like you did something wrong by surviving when your husband didn't. Like you should have just disappeared after he died instead of having the audacity to keep breathing and needing to eat and looking for work. It's cruel and it's stupid, and I'm tired of watching people treat you like you're shameful for not dying along with him." Clara stared at him like he'd started speaking another language. Wade realized he'd said too much, revealed too much, but he couldn't take it back now. He turned away and started carrying supplies toward the house, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid with tension he didn't know how to release. Behind him, Clara's voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "Thank you." He didn't acknowledge it, didn't trust himself to say anything else without making things even more awkward. Just kept walking until he was inside the house, and then he stood in the kitchen for a long moment trying to figure out when he'd started caring so much about whether Clara stayed or left. When he'd started seeing her as something other than an employee he'd hired out of impulse and guilt. When he'd started feeling things he had no business feeling for a woman who wasn't his wife and never could be. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Wade sat on the porch and smoked and tried to convince himself he was just being protective of someone vulnerable. Tried to convince himself it wasn't anything more complicated than that. Failed spectacularly. The fourth week, Vernon Pike came to visit. Wade was in the barn checking on a horse with a bad hoof when he heard voices from the house. Male voices, multiple, and none of them friendly. He dropped the horse's leg and moved quickly, instinct telling him this was exactly the kind of trouble Tom had warned him about. 3 men stood in his yard, Pike in the center, flanked by 2 ranch hands Wade recognized but didn't know by name. Pike was in his 50s, heavy-set but strong, with the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed the cold calculation in his eyes. He owned the largest ranch in the territory and had spent 20 years building power through a combination of business savvy and strategic cruelty. Clara stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, and Caleb was visible through the window looking scared. Wade forced himself to walk calmly, even though everything in him wanted to run. "Pike, what can I do for you?" Pike smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Wade Mercer, haven't seen you at the cattlemen's meetings lately. Starting to wonder if you'd forgotten you're part of this community." "Been busy." "I can see that." Pike's gaze slid to Clara, then back to Wade. "Heard you've made some changes around here. Thought I'd come by and see for myself." Wade moved to position himself between Pike and the porch, subtle but deliberate. And I'm concerned." Pike's voice took on a tone of false sincerity that made Wade's teeth ache. "You're a good man, Wade. Always have been. But since Margaret passed, well, people worry you're not thinking clearly, making decisions that might not be in your best interest. My decisions are my own business." "Usually, yes, but when those decisions affect the whole community, they become everyone's business." Pike gestured toward Clara without looking at her directly. "You've brought an unmarried woman into your home. Let her live here, work here, spend time alone with your boy. Now, I'm sure your intentions are good, but you have to understand how it looks." Wade's hands curled into fists. "How it looks to who?" "To everyone. To the families who do business with you, to the church, to the other ranchers who've been your neighbors for years." Pike stepped closer, voice dropping to something more intimate, like they were friends having a difficult conversation. "People are saying you've dishonored Margaret's memory, that you're setting a bad example for your son, that maybe you're not as stable as we all thought you were. Get off my property." Pike's false friendliness cracked slightly, Now, Wade, get off my property, Wade repeated, voice low and dangerous. And tell whoever sent you to deliver this message that I don't give a damn what they think about my household. One of Pike's men shifted his weight, hand moving toward his belt. Wade recognized the preparation for violence, felt his own body respond in kind. Every muscle tensing for a fight he knew he couldn't win against three men, but would have anyway because the alternative was backing down, and he was done backing down. Wade! Clara's voice from the porch, steady despite the fear Wade could hear underneath. Don't! Pike glanced at her, then back at Wade, and something ugly crossed his face. You're letting her speak for you now? That's even worse than I heard. Wade moved before he could think it through, closing the distance between them fast enough that Pike's men barely had time to react. He got right in Pike's face, close enough to see the surprise and then the anger flash across the older man's features. You want to insult me? Fine, Wade said quietly. But you speak about her with respect, or we're going to have a problem that won't be settled with words. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Pike smiled, slow and cold. You're making a mistake, Wade, a bad one. And when this all falls apart, and it will fall apart, don't come crying to the rest of us for help. He turned and walked back to his horse, his men following. They mounted up and rode out without looking back, and Wade stood in his yard watching them go, adrenaline making his hands shake. Behind him, Clara let out a breath she'd been holding. You shouldn't have done that. Yeah, Wade said. I know. He's going to make things worse now. Probably. Wade. She came down off the porch, moved to stand beside him. I meant what I said before. I can leave. It would solve no. Wade turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw the fear and the guilt and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd spent too long believing she was the cause of every problem in her vicinity. You're not leaving, not because of Pike, not because of gossip, not because of anything. You hear me? Clara's eyes were shining, though whether from tears or anger or something else Wade couldn't tell. Why are you doing this? It was the question Wade had been avoiding asking himself for 4 weeks. The answer should have been simple. Because it was the right thing to do. Because he'd made an offer and intended to honor it. Because Caleb needed stability, and Clara provided that. But standing there in his yard with the dust still settling from Pike's departure, Wade realized the real answer was more complicated and more frightening than he wanted to admit. Because this place stopped feeling like a graveyard after you arrived, he said finally, and I'm not ready to go back to that. Clara stared at him, something shifting in her expression that Wade couldn't read. Then Caleb's voice called from inside the house, Papa, is everything okay? And the moment broke. Yeah, buddy, Wade called back. Everything's fine. It wasn't fine, and they both knew it. But they went inside anyway, and Clara made dinner while Wade helped Caleb with arithmetic, and they all pretended that Vernon Pike's visit hadn't just changed everything. The following week, things got worse. Tom Bellamy stopped giving Wade credit at the store, claiming his accounts were overextended. 2 neighboring ranchers who'd always been friendly suddenly had no time to talk when Wade rode past their properties. A family who'd been planning to buy 3 head of cattle from Wade canceled without explanation. Wade understood what was happening. Pike was using his influence to isolate the Mercer ranch economically. It was a quiet kind of warfare, the kind that happened in frontier communities when someone violated the unspoken rules. You didn't destroy them overtly, you just made sure everyone else refused to do business with them until they either fell in line or fell apart. Clara noticed, even though Wade tried to hide it. We're running low on flour, she said one morning. I'll get some next week. We're running low on a lot of things. Wade didn't answer, just drank his coffee and stared out the window at cattle that suddenly might be harder to sell than he'd anticipated. That afternoon, while Caleb was playing by the creek, Clara cornered Wade in the barn. Tell me the truth, she said. How bad is it? Wade considered lying, decided she deserved better. Pike's making it hard for people to trade with us. We're not in trouble yet, but if this keeps up, you'll lose the ranch. We'll survive. Might have to tighten things up, but Wade, Clara's voice was firm. Stop pretending this isn't serious. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw that she was angry. Not at him exactly, but at the situation. At the unfairness of a world that punished people for small acts of kindness and rewarded men like Pike for cruelty. What do you want me to say? Wade asked. That I made a mistake hiring you? That I should have left you sitting outside that trading post? That would have been safer, sure, but what? But I couldn't, Wade said simply. Caleb saw you and said you looked lonely, and he was right, and I couldn't just pretend I didn't see it too. Clara's anger cracked, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. You barely knew me. Didn't need to know you deserved better than what this town was giving you. They stood there in the dim barn, dust motes drifting through shafts of sunlight, and Wade felt the weight of everything they weren't saying pressing down like a physical force. I don't know what to do, Clara said finally, and it was the first time Wade had heard her admit any kind of helplessness. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe it can't be fixed. Maybe we just have to endure it. For how long? Wade didn't have an answer for that. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, Wade heard Clara crying through the wall. Quiet, muffled sobs she was clearly trying to hide. The sound of someone who'd spent years learning to grieve privately because letting anyone see weakness was dangerous. He lay there listening, hands clenched in the sheets, and hated Vernon Pike with an intensity that felt almost cleansing. Hated the town for its cruelty. Hated the system that gave men like Pike power and left women like Clara with nothing. But mostly, Wade hated himself for not having a solution, for bringing Clara into his home and his life and then failing to protect her from the consequences. The crying stopped eventually. Wade still didn't sleep. And in the morning, when Clara came out looking like she hadn't rested at all, Wade made a decision. He was going to fight back. He didn't know how yet, didn't have a plan, didn't have resources or allies or any kind of strategic advantage, but he'd figure something out. Because the alternative, watching everything fall apart while Pike smiled and the town whispered and Clara blamed herself for existing, was unacceptable. That afternoon, while Clara was teaching Caleb his letters and Wade was supposed to be repairing fence line, a rider appeared on the northern horizon. Young guy, maybe early 20s, riding hard like something was chasing him. Wade rode out to intercept him, hand resting on the rifle strapped to his saddle just in case this was more trouble arriving. The rider pulled up, breathing hard, and Wade recognized him as one of the hands from a small ranch about 15 miles east. You Wade Mercer? The kid asked. That's right. Got a message from my boss. Says if you're interested, there's a group of smaller ranchers meeting tomorrow night at the old Miller homestead. Says Pike's been squeezing everyone, not just you, and maybe it's time folks started talking about doing something about it. Wade felt something shift in his chest. Who's your boss? Samuel Chen. He runs the Triple Bar Spread. Wade knew Chen by reputation. Honest man, kept to himself, had immigrated from California a decade earlier and built a respectable operation through hard work and smart grazing management. If Chen was organizing resistance, that meant things were worse than Wade realized. Tell Chen I'll be there, Wade said. The kid nodded and rode off, and Wade sat on his horse for a long moment, thinking, maybe fighting back wouldn't just be about protecting Clara and the ranch. Maybe it would be about changing the whole rotten system that made men like Pike untouchable and people like Clara disposable. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that could get you killed if you weren't careful. But Wade was tired of being careful. He rode back to the house and found Clara and Caleb inside, the boy reading aloud from a primer while Clara listened with patient attention. They looked up when he came in, and Wade saw the question in Clara's eyes. Things are going to get complicated, he said. Clara didn't look surprised. More complicated than they already are? Yeah. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Then I guess we'd better be ready. And that simple acceptance, the way she said we instead of you, the way she didn't flinch or offer to leave again, the way she just squared her shoulders and prepared for whatever came next, made Wade realize something that probably should have terrified him. He wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere in the past month, without really intending to, they'd become something that resembled a team, and Vernon Pike had no idea what he'd started. The old Miller homestead sat in a valley 20 miles northwest of Wade's ranch, abandoned for 5 years after the family had given up and moved back east. The house had collapsed in on itself during a winter storm, but the barn still stood, and that's where Wade found 12 other men waiting when he arrived just after sundown. Samuel Chen stood near the barn's entrance, a lantern hanging from a post casting shadows across his weathered face. He was shorter than Wade, compact and solid, with black hair going gray at the temples and eyes that missed nothing. When Wade dismounted, Chen extended his hand without hesitation. "Glad you came." Wade shook it. "Glad to be invited." Inside the barn, the other men sat on hay bales or leaned against support beams, and Wade recognized most of them. Small ranchers, all of them. The kind of operators who survived season to season, who couldn't afford a bad year, who lived constantly aware that one drought or disease outbreak or market collapse could destroy everything they'd built. "Everyone's here," Chen said, raising his voice slightly. "Let's get started." The group fell silent, attention shifting to Chen, like he was someone they'd agreed to follow even though nobody had said it out loud. "Most of you know why we're meeting," Chen continued. "Vernon Pike's been systematically destroying anyone who won't fall in line with his operation. Some of you lost water rights, some lost access to markets. Some just found yourselves suddenly unable to get credit or supplies or help when you needed it." He paused, letting that sink in. "And all of it's been quiet enough that nobody outside this valley would call it what it actually is: extortion." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the barn. A man Wade knew as Henry Larson spoke up. "Pike came to my place 2 months ago. Said if I didn't sell my north pasture to him at half what it's worth, he'd make sure my cattle couldn't get to market. I told him to go to hell. Next week, my herd got spooked in the night, stampeded through 2 fences, and by the time I rounded them up, I'd lost 8 head. Can't prove it was Pike's men, but I know it was. He's been buying up water access upstream for my land," another man added. "Come summer, my creek's going to run dry and I'll have to either buy water from Pike at whatever price he names or watch my herd die of thirst." More stories followed, each one a variation on the same theme. Pike had been building a monopoly through intimidation and strategic cruelty, and he'd been doing it carefully enough that no single incident was dramatic enough to spark organized resistance. Until now. Wade waited until the stories stopped, then spoke. "Pike came to my ranch last week. Told me I needed to send Clara Whitmore away or face consequences." Several men shifted uncomfortably. Wade could see them doing the calculation. Was Wade's situation the same as theirs, or was he being punished for something they'd all been taught to see as inappropriate? Chen cut through the tension. "Pike doesn't care about Wade's household arrangements. He cares that Wade embarrassed one of his men and then refused to apologize for it. The woman's just an excuse." He looked around the barn. "Pike needs us divided, needs us thinking our problems are individual instead of collective. That's how he maintains power." "So what do we do?" Larson asked. "Pike owns half the territory. He's got connections to buyers we need. He controls water rights and grazing access, and he controls those things because we let him," Chen interrupted. "Because every time he came for one of us, the rest of us looked away and told ourselves it wasn't our problem." The barn went silent again, heavy with the weight of acknowledged complicity. Finally, a younger man Wade didn't recognize spoke up. "You're talking about organizing against him. That could get people killed." "Staying divided is already killing us," Chen said flatly. "Just slower. Pike's been picking us off one at a time for years. How many ranches have failed in the last 5 years? How many families packed up and left? How many of you are one bad season away from losing everything?" Nobody answered, which was answer enough. Chen pulled out a hand-drawn map and spread it across a hay bale. "Here's what I'm proposing. We pool resources, share water access across properties, coordinate our cattle drives so Pike can't blockade any single rancher, support each other's credit at the store so Tom Bellamy can't use debt as a weapon, and most importantly," he looked up, meeting each man's eyes, "we stop pretending Pike's just a tough businessman and start treating him like what he is. A bully who only has power because we're too scared to stand together." Wade studied the map, seeing the logic of it immediately. Chen had marked every property in the valley, shown where water sources could be shared, where combined herds could graze more efficiently, where the smaller ranchers could create a network that made them less vulnerable to Pike's pressure. It was smart. It was also dangerous as hell. "Pike's not going to just let this happen," Wade said. "He'll escalate." "Probably," Chen agreed, "which is why we need to be ready for that. No violence unless he starts it, but we defend ourselves and each other if it comes to that." Larson shook his head. "Some of us have families, kids. I can't risk—" "You think staying quiet is less risky?" Chen's voice hardened. You think Pike's just going to leave you alone if you keep your head down? He's already coming for you, Henry, for all of us. The only question is whether we face it alone or together. The barn descended into argument then, men talking over each other, some advocating for Chen's plan, others insisting it was suicide, everyone scared and angry and trying to figure out which choice would destroy them slower. Wade listened to it all and thought about Clara, about the way she'd squared her shoulders and said "we" when he'd warned her things would get complicated, about Caleb's face when he'd heard those men at the saloon insulting her, about the sound of her crying through the wall because she blamed herself for problems that weren't her fault. He stood up, and something in his posture made the others fall quiet. "I'm in," Wade said. "Whatever Chen's planning, I'm in." Chen nodded slowly, something like respect crossing his face. "Even though you're the one Pike's targeting most directly right now. Especially because of that. I'm tired of letting men like Pike decide who deserves dignity and who doesn't." Wade looked around the barn. "My wife used to help people, brought strangers into our home, fed families who had nothing, never asked for anything in return, and this town respected her for it, or pretended to anyway. But the minute I tried to do the same thing after she died, suddenly it's scandalous. Suddenly, I'm the problem." He shook his head. "That's not about morality. That's about control. And I'm done being controlled." Several men looked away, uncomfortable with Wade's directness, but Larson surprised everyone by standing. "I'm in too." Then another man stood, and another. By the time the meeting ended an hour later, all 12 ranchers had committed to Chen's plan. They'd share water, coordinate grazing, support each other economically, and present a united front against Pike's intimidation. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Wade rode home through darkness that felt less oppressive than it had in months, and when he arrived, Clara was still awake, sitting on the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "How'd it go?" she asked. Wade dismounted, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "We're organizing. 12 ranchers committed to supporting each other against Pike." Clara studied his face. "That's good. But you look worried." "I am worried. Pike's not going to take this lying down." "No," Clara agreed. "He's not." They sat there together in silence, and Wade realized this was the first time they'd been alone like this. Really alone, without Caleb nearby or work providing an excuse for proximity. It should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt natural in a way that terrified him. "Clara," he started, then stopped, not sure what he was trying to say. She waited, patient as always. "If this goes bad, if Pike retaliates and things get dangerous, I want you to take Caleb and go to Chen's ranch. He'll keep you safe." "And leave you to face Pike alone?" Clara shook her head. "Not happening. I'm serious. You and Caleb shouldn't be anywhere near Wade." Clara turned to look at him directly. "I spent 2 years after my husband died being invisible, being someone people look through instead of at. You're the first person since Thomas who's treated me like I matter, like I'm not just a problem to be solved or ignored." Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in the shawl. "So no, I'm not leaving. Whatever happens, I'm staying." Wade wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the rational reasons why she should prioritize safety over loyalty to a man she'd known for barely 2 months. But the words wouldn't come, because part of him, a part he wasn't ready to examine too closely, didn't want her to leave. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay close to the house when things get tense. And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." "I'll consider it." "Clara." She smiled slightly, and it transformed her face in a way that made Wade's chest ache. "I said I'll consider it. That's the best you're getting." Wade shook his head but couldn't quite suppress his own smile. "You're stubborn." "So are you." "Fair point." They lapsed into comfortable silence again, and Wade tried not to think about how right this felt. How easy it would be to reach over and take her hand. How much he wanted to close the distance between them and see if she'd pull away or lean closer. Margaret had been gone 3 years. Was that long enough? Was there even a timeline for this kind of thing, or did you just wake up one day and realize the grief had shifted into something that allowed space for other feelings? Wade didn't know, didn't trust himself to know. So he stood abruptly, mumbled something about checking the barn, and left before he could do something stupid. Behind him, Clara's quiet voice followed. "Good night, Wade." "Good night." He didn't sleep much that night either. The retaliation came faster than anyone expected. 3 days after the meeting, one of Chen's barns burned down. Nobody saw who started it, but everyone knew. The fire destroyed winter feed stores that would have sustained Chen's herd through the cold months, and the message was clear. Organize against Pike and pay the price. Wade heard about it from Larson, who rode to the Mercer ranch at dawn looking shaken. Chen's asking for help, Larson said. He's got enough feed to last maybe 6 weeks. After that, his herd starves or he sells at a loss to Pike. Wade felt cold fury settle in his gut. Where's Pike now? Town. Drinking at the saloon like he didn't just destroy a man's livelihood. Wade grabbed his rifle from inside the house. Clara appeared in the doorway, took one look at his face, and went pale. Don't do anything stupid, she said. I'm just going to talk to him. Wade, I'm not going to shoot him, Clara, but he needs to know this won't work. That burning one barn won't make the rest of us back down. He rode out before she could argue further, Larson following, and they reached Blackthorn Ridge by mid-morning. Pike's horse was tied outside the saloon along with several others Wade recognized as belonging to Pike's regular crew. Wade dismounted and handed his rifle to Larson. Stay here. You sure that's smart? Going in unarmed? If I bring the rifle, this turns into something I can't take back. Wade pushed through the saloon doors and found Pike at a corner table with 4 of his men. They looked up when he entered, and Pike's face split into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Wade Mercer. Come to finally see sense? Wade walked to the table slowly, aware of every eye in the saloon tracking his movement. You burned Chen's barn. Pike took a long drink from his whiskey glass. That's a serious accusation. You got proof? Don't need proof. Everyone knows it was you. Knowing and proving are different things. Pike leaned back in his chair. But let's say hypothetically, someone got tired of Chen stirring up trouble and decided to teach him a lesson. What exactly do you plan to do about it? Wade felt his hands curl into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to drag Pike out of that chair and beat him bloody. But that was exactly what Pike wanted. An excuse to paint Wade as violent and unstable, to justify whatever retaliation came next. So Wade forced himself to stay calm. The 12 of us signed agreements yesterday, legal contracts that tie our operations together. You come after one of us, you're coming after all of us. And we will respond. Pike's smile faded slightly. Legal contracts don't mean much out here. They mean enough, especially when we take them to the territorial marshal and file formal complaints about intimidation and property destruction. You think the marshal cares about range disputes? He's got bigger problems. Maybe. But he'll definitely care when 12 ranchers show up with documented evidence of systematic harassment, when we show him how you've been manipulating water rights and blocking market access and burning barns. Wade leaned forward, keeping his voice low and steady. You've gotten away with this because we've been divided. That ends now. Pike's eyes narrowed, and Wade saw the calculation happening. Was Wade bluffing, or had the ranchers actually created the kind of legal framework that could cause real problems? You're making a mistake, Pike said finally. You think you're protecting that woman, but all you're doing is dragging everyone down with you. When this falls apart, and it will, those 12 ranchers will blame you for it. Maybe, but at least we'll have tried. Wade straightened. Stay away from Chen. Stay away from all of us. Or the next conversation happens with the marshal present. He turned and walked out before Pike could respond, before his self-control cracked, before he did something that couldn't be undone. Outside, Larson exhaled heavily. That went better than I expected. Thought for sure there'd be shooting. Wade took his rifle back, hand still shaking slightly from suppressed adrenaline. There still might be. Pike's not the type to back down from a challenge. They rode back to Chen's ranch and found him surveying the burned barn, face grim. Wade told him about the conversation with Pike, about the threats and the warning. Chen listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. Good. He needs to know we're serious. You think it'll work? No, Chen said honestly. I think Pike will escalate, but at least now he knows what he's up against. Over the next 2 weeks, the ranchers worked to implement Chen's plan. They drew up formal contracts sharing water rights. They coordinated a joint cattle drive that would bypass Pike's usual control points. They pooled money to help Chen replace his lost feed, and Pike watched it all happen with increasing fury. Wade felt the tension building like pressure before a storm. Every time he went to town, people stared. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Tom Bellamy started refusing to extend credit to any of the 12 ranchers, claiming he couldn't risk Pike's retaliation. Clara felt it too. She stopped going to town entirely after a group of women from the church confronted her outside the trading post, saying things Wade only heard about later from Larson's wife. That Clara was a fallen woman, that she was leading Wade astray, that she should leave the territory before her presence destroyed any more families. Wade came home that evening and found Clara in the kitchen, face carefully neutral but eyes red-rimmed. "What happened?" he demanded. "Nothing. Just town talk." "Clara." She set down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables. "Some women from the church told me I should leave, said I was a bad influence on Caleb, that I was dishonoring your wife's memory, that—" Her voice cracked. "That everything happening to you is my fault." Wade felt something break inside him. "That's not true, isn't it? If I hadn't accepted your offer, Pike wouldn't be targeting you. The other ranchers wouldn't be at risk. You'd still have credit at the store, and I'd still be half dead," Wade interrupted harshly. "And Caleb would still be growing up in a house that felt like a tomb. And yeah, maybe things would be simpler, but they sure as hell wouldn't be better." Clara looked up at him, something desperate in her expression. "How can you say that? You're losing everything because of me." "I'm not losing anything that matters." Wade moved closer, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "Everything I actually care about is right here, in this house. And I'm not letting Pike or the church ladies or anyone else tell me that caring about you is wrong." The words hung in the air between them, and Wade realized too late how much he'd just revealed. Clara stared at him, lips parted, breathing unsteady. "Wade?" Before either of them could say anything else, Caleb burst through the door holding a dead snake he'd killed with a stick, demanding they acknowledge his bravery. The moment shattered. Wade helped his son dispose of the snake while Clara finished dinner, and they all ate together like nothing had happened. But something had shifted between Wade and Clara. Some invisible line had been crossed, and they both knew it, even if neither was ready to acknowledge it out loud. That night, lying in bed, Wade finally let himself think about what he'd said, about what it meant. He'd fallen for her. Somewhere between the first awkward week and the confrontation with Pike, and all the quiet dinners where Caleb laughed and Clara smiled, Wade had fallen completely and irrevocably for a woman who wasn't his wife, and probably shouldn't be anything to him except an employee. And the worst part was that he didn't feel guilty about it anymore. Margaret was gone. Had been gone for 3 years. And Wade had spent those years pretending he was honoring her memory by staying frozen in grief. But really, he'd just been too scared to live again. Clara made him want to live, made him want to build something instead of just surviving, made him remember what it felt like to care about tomorrow instead of just enduring today. But admitting that meant letting go of the last pieces of Margaret he'd been clinging to, and Wade wasn't sure he knew how to do that without feeling like he was betraying her all over again. He fell asleep still trying to figure it out, and woke to Caleb shaking his shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness. "Papa, Papa, wake up. Something's wrong with the cattle." Wade was on his feet instantly, pulling on pants, grabbing his rifle. "What do you mean?" "I heard them. They sound scared." Wade rushed outside and immediately heard what Caleb meant. The cattle were lowing frantically from the south pasture, a sound of distress that made his gut clench with dread. Clara appeared on the porch, still in her nightgown. "What's happening?" "Stay inside with Caleb. Lock the door." Wade ran toward the pasture, heart pounding, and crested the ridge to find chaos. Someone had cut the fence and driven the herd toward the creek. Not the normal grazing creek, but the steep ravine 200 yards beyond it, where the water ran fast and dangerous over rocks. In the darkness, the cattle couldn't see where they were going, and already Wade could hear splashing and panicked bellowing as animals went over the edge. He fired his rifle into the air, trying to turn the herd, but they were too spooked, moving too fast. And then he saw the riders. 3 men on horseback, faces covered with bandanas, driving the cattle deliberately toward the ravine. Pike's men. Wade fired again, this time aiming for the riders, but they scattered into darkness before he could get a clear shot. By the time he reached the creek, the damage was done. 8 head of cattle had gone into the ravine. Wade could see their broken bodies on the rocks below, could hear the ones that were still alive screaming in agony. He stood there breathing hard, rifle hanging loose in his hand, and felt something inside him snap. This wasn't just economic pressure anymore. This was Pike declaring war. And wars required more than legal contracts and united fronts. They required people willing to fight. Wade rode to Chen's ranch before sunrise and found him already awake, like he'd been expecting bad news. "They drove 8 of my cattle into the ravine," Wade said without preamble. "Pike's men. I saw them." Chen's jaw tightened. "Anyone hurt?" "Just the animals, but next time—" Wade stopped, forced himself to stay calm. "Next time it could be my son, or Clara, or someone's family." "I know." Chen moved to his porch railing, staring out at the mountains barely visible in the pre-dawn light. "Pike's testing us, seeing if we'll break or fight back." "So what do we do?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then, "There's grazing land north of here, beyond the mountain pass. Old territory that got abandoned after bad winters killed off the families trying to work it." Wade knew the land Chen meant. He'd crossed those mountains as a teenager, had nearly died doing it. That pass is suicide in winter. "It's early autumn. We'd have maybe 6 weeks before the worst weather hits." "You're talking about moving entire herds through mountains that killed experienced ranchers." "I'm talking about moving our operations out of Pike's reach." Chen turned to look at Wade directly. "He controls this valley because he controls the water and the access routes, but that northern territory has everything we need: water, grazing, protection from the wind. If we can get our herds through the pass, we'd be beyond Pike's influence." Wade thought about it. Thought about the logistics, the danger, the possibility of losing everything if the weather turned bad. But he also thought about 8 dead cattle, and Clara crying in the kitchen, and Caleb growing up watching his father bow to bullies. "How many of the others would come?" Wade asked. "All of them, if we frame it right. They're already at risk here. At least in the north they'd have a chance. And if we don't make it through the pass?" Chen smiled grimly. "Then at least we tried, which is more than any of us can say we've been doing for the last 5 years." Wade extended his hand. "When do we leave?" They shook on it, and Wade felt the weight of the decision settle over him like a physical thing. He was gambling everything: the ranch, his son's safety, Clara's trust, on a journey through mountains that might kill them all. But staying meant slow death under Pike's harassment. At least the mountains gave them a chance. Wade rode home to find Clara and Caleb waiting on the porch, both looking worried. "We're leaving," Wade said. "In 3 days, taking the herd north through the mountain pass." Clara's face went white. "Wade, that's—" "I know, but Pike just killed 8 of our cattle and he's not stopping. If we stay here, we're finished. And if the pass kills us, we're also finished. At least we'll have tried to escape instead of just waiting to die slowly." Clara stared at him, and Wade could see her working through the same calculations he'd already done, coming to the same grim conclusions. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" And just like that, they were committed. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Wade and the other ranchers coordinated timing, pooled supplies, arranged for wagons to carry families and provisions. Clara packed everything they could carry: food, clothes, medical supplies, blankets, ammunition. Caleb sensed the tension but didn't fully understand it. He was excited about an adventure, about seeing mountains, about traveling with other families. Wade envied that innocence. On their last night at the ranch, Wade stood on the porch and looked out at the land he'd built with Margaret, the house they'd raised together, the fields where she'd planted wildflowers, the barn where she'd taught Caleb to milk goats. He was leaving all of it behind, maybe forever. Clara came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You all right?" she asked quietly. Wade shook his head. "Margaret and I built this place from nothing. Every board, every fence post, every acre. Walking away from it feels like losing her again," Clara finished. "Yeah." They stood in silence, and then Clara did something that surprised him. She reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Wade's breath caught. "You're not losing her," Clara said. "You're carrying her forward. Everything she taught you, everything you built together, that goes with you. That's not tied to this land." Wade looked down at their joined hands, and something tight in his chest finally loosened. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. Clara smiled sadly. "About the time I lost everything and realized places don't matter as much as people do." Wade squeezed her hand, and they stood there together watching the sun set behind the mountains they'd be crossing in the morning. Behind them, inside the house, Caleb was singing to himself while packing his rocks. And for just a moment, despite everything, Wade felt something that might have been hope. They left at first light, 13 families strung out in a line that stretched nearly half a mile across the valley floor. Cattle lowed and kicked up dust. Wagon wheels creaked under the weight of everything people had decided was worth saving. Children who'd been excited the night before now clung to their mothers, sensing the fear underneath all the adult talk about adventure and new opportunities. Wade rode at the front beside Chen, scanning the horizon for trouble they both knew was coming. "Pike's gonna know we left within the hour," Chen said quietly. "Yeah." Wade shifted in his saddle, rifle resting across his lap. "Question is whether he'll try to stop us or just let the mountains do his work for him. My money's on both." They'd made it maybe 5 miles when Caleb called out from the wagon. "Papa, someone's following us." Wade turned and saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. Multiple riders, moving fast. "Keep the herd moving," Wade told Chen, then spurred his horse back toward Clara's wagon. She already had the reins tight in her hands, face pale, but determined. "Get between the other wagons," Wade said. "Stay in the middle of the group." "How many?" Wade looked back at the approaching riders. "Too many." He rode to meet them, positioning himself between Pike's men and the caravan, and was unsurprised when Vernon Pike himself emerged from the dust, flanked by 8 armed riders. Pike pulled up about 20 yards away, close enough to talk, but far enough that any shooting would require deliberate aim. His face was red with fury barely contained. "You think you can just leave?" Pike shouted. "You think I'll let you take cattle through my territory without paying passage fees?" "We're not on your land," Wade called back. "Haven't been since we crossed the creek. Every acre from here to the mountains is under my grazing contracts. You want to cross? You pay." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Pike had the men and the guns to make it true if Wade didn't have an answer. Chen rode up beside Wade, followed by Larson and 3 other ranchers. They formed a line facing Pike's men, and Wade saw several of Pike's riders shift nervously. 8 against 6 wasn't great odds when you factored in that the 6 were defending families. "We're not paying you a damn thing," Chen said flatly. "And if you try to stop us, you'll be shooting ranchers in front of their wives and children. That's the kind of thing territorial marshals actually care about." Pike's jaw worked like he was chewing something tough. "You'll die in those mountains." "Maybe," Wade said. "But that's our choice to make." For a long moment, nobody moved. Wade's hand rested on his rifle, pulse hammering in his ears, aware that this could turn into bloodshed in seconds, and there were children close enough to see it happen. Then one of Pike's men, the older one Wade vaguely recognized from town, spoke up. "Boss, I didn't sign up to shoot families." Pike turned on him viciously. "You signed up to do what I tell you." "Not this." The man looked at the other riders. "I got kids of my own. I ain't shooting someone's wagon train." 2 more of Pike's men nodded agreement, and Wade saw Pike's control slipping. The man's power had always depended on people being more afraid of him than they were of their own consciences. But apparently there were still lines some wouldn't cross. Pike's face went from red to purple. "You'll regret this, Mercer. All of you. That pass will kill you, and when winter comes and you're starving in those mountains, don't come crawling back expecting help." "Wouldn't dream of it," Wade said. Pike wheeled his horse around and rode off, his remaining men following, but 3 of the riders stayed behind, including the older man who'd spoken up. "Name's Jim Cooper," the man said, directing his words to Chen. "I've been working for Pike 3 years, and I'm done. If you're heading north, I'd like to come along. I can work, I can fight if needed, and I know cattle." Chen glanced at Wade, a silent question. Wade studied Cooper for a long moment. The man looked tired and ashamed, like he'd been compromising himself for too long and finally found a line he couldn't cross. That wasn't proof of good character, but it was something. "You got family?" Wade asked. "Wife and 2 boys. They're back in town. Pike doesn't know I'm quitting yet. I can get them and catch up to you before nightfall." "You do that," Chen said, "and bring anyone else who wants out from under Pike's thumb. But you're responsible for them. Anyone causes trouble, they're your problem." Cooper nodded gratefully and rode off with the other 2 men. Wade watched them go and felt the weight of what they'd just done settle over him. They'd openly defied Pike, exposed the cracks in his control, and recruited some of his own men. There was no going back from this. Whatever happened in the mountains, they'd burned every bridge behind them. He rode back to check on Clara and found her gripping the rein so tight her knuckles were white. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded jerkily. "I thought for sure there'd be shooting." "Almost was. I know. I had the rifle loaded." She glanced back at the wagon bed where Caleb sat surrounded by carefully packed supplies. "He didn't see me do it, but I was ready." Something about that image, Clara, who'd probably never fired a gun in anger, preparing to defend his son, made Wade's throat tight. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, and for a moment the fear dropped away from her face, replaced by something fiercer. "I meant what I said before. Whatever happens, I'm staying." Wade reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, then rode back to the front before he could say something they weren't ready for. They made camp that night at the base of the foothills, close enough to the mountains that everyone could see what they were facing. The peaks rose dark and jagged against the evening sky, still snow-capped from last winter, looking more like a wall than a passage. Chen had maps from a survey party that had attempted the crossing 15 years earlier, but the maps were crude and marked several sections as impassable, without explanation. They'd be navigating partly on guesswork and partly on Wade's memory of a route he'd traveled once as a teenager, delirious with fever at the time. Not exactly confidence-inspiring. The families gathered around the central fire after dinner, and Chen addressed them honestly. "The pass will take 5 days minimum if everything goes perfect. More likely 7 or 8. We'll be exposed to weather with limited shelter. The trail's narrow in places. Wagons might have to be taken apart and carried. And if someone gets hurt or sick, we can't turn back. Once we're in the mountains, we're committed." "What if the snow comes early?" a woman asked. "Then we die," Chen said bluntly. "I'm not going to lie to you. This could kill all of us. But staying in that valley was guaranteed to destroy us slowly. At least this way we're fighting for something instead of just accepting defeat." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Larson's wife stood up, a baby on her hip. "I'd rather die trying to build something new than live on my knees watching my husband get ground down by men like Pike. We're with you." Others murmured agreement, and Wade saw the determination settle over the group like armor. They were scared. Everyone was scared, but they were together, and that counted for something. Cooper arrived just before midnight with his family and 4 others who'd decided to abandon Pike's operation. That brought their numbers to 18 families total, plus maybe 200 head of cattle between them. Wade helped Cooper's boys settle their wagon, then walked the perimeter of the camp. Everything was quiet, except for the cattle and the occasional cry of a child waking from nightmares. He found Clara sitting alone near the edge of camp, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the mountains. "Caleb asleep?" Wade asked, settling down beside her. "Finally, he's excited. Thinks this is all a grand adventure." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I wish I could see it that way." "You and me both." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only developed between people who'd learned to exist in each other's presence without needing to fill every moment with words. "I keep thinking about Thomas," Clara said eventually. "My husband. He died trying to protect our wagon from raiders. Just threw himself at them without thinking, without a plan, and they shot him 3 times before I even realized what was happening." Her voice was steady, but soft. "For the longest time I was angry at him for being so reckless, for leaving me alone. But sitting here now, about to do something just as dangerous, I think I finally understand it." Wade waited, knowing she needed to work through this out loud. "He wasn't being reckless," Clara continued. "He was fighting for something worth fighting for. And maybe he didn't have a great plan, and maybe the odds were terrible, but at least he tried. At least he didn't just accept that bad things happen, and there's nothing you can do about it." She turned to look at Wade. "That's what you're doing. What all of you are doing, fighting instead of accepting. Might be stupid," Wade said. "Might get everyone killed. Might save everyone instead." Wade thought about that. About Margaret and how she would have approached this situation, probably with more optimism than he could muster, but also with the same stubborn refusal to let cruelty win without a fight. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Not for me, but Caleb's counting on me to keep him safe. He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. "I'm what?" Wade took a breath. "You're important," To Caleb. To the ranch. To... He forced himself to say it. To me. Clara went very still beside him. I know the timing's terrible, Wade continued, words coming faster now that he'd started. And I know we're probably both going to die in those mountains. And even if we don't, there's about 100 reasons why this is complicated. But I needed you to know, before we go into the pass, that you matter. Clara was quiet for so long Wade started to regret saying anything. Then she reached over and found his hand in the darkness, threading her fingers through his like she had on the porch 3 nights ago. You matter too, she whispered. More than I expected. More than I probably should let you matter. Wade squeezed her hand, and they sat there together watching the mountains and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. In the morning, they started climbing. The first day wasn't terrible. The trail was steep but manageable, winding through pine forests that provided cover from the wind. They made decent progress, and by nightfall they'd gained enough elevation that the valley behind them looked small and distant. The second day was harder. The trees thinned out and the wind picked up, cutting through clothes and finding every gap in the wagons. 2 children developed fevers, forcing stops so their mothers could tend them. 1 wagon lost a wheel and had to be repaired, costing them 3 hours. They camped that night in a narrow ravine that offered minimal shelter, and Wade lay awake listening to the wind howl and wondering if they'd made a catastrophic mistake. The third day, the snow started. Not a blizzard, just scattered flurries that dusted the rocks and made the trail slippery. But it was only early October, and if snow was already falling this high up, the true winter storms weren't far behind. Chen pulled Wade aside during a break. We need to move faster. At this rate, we won't clear the pass before the heavy snow hits. Wagons can't go much faster on this terrain. Then we leave the wagons behind. Take what we can carry, keep the cattle moving, and rebuild on the other side. Wade looked back at the families huddled in their wagons, at children who'd already been uprooted from the only homes they'd known, now being asked to abandon the last remnants of their old lives. That's asking a lot, Wade said. Staying on this mountain through a blizzard is asking more. Chen was right, and Wade knew it. They called a meeting and explained the situation as honestly as they could. People would have to choose, keep the wagons and risk getting trapped by weather, or abandon them and push hard for the northern valley. Most families chose to push on, but 3 families, 2 of the ones who joined from Pike's crew, plus 1 older couple with health problems, decided to turn back and take their chances returning to the valley. Wade watched them go with a sick feeling in his gut, knowing they were probably making the safer choice but unable to shake the sense that he'd failed them somehow. The group that remained was now 15 families, and they moved faster without the wagons slowing them down. People carried supplies on their backs or loaded them onto the stronger cattle. Children too young to walk rode on horseback. Everything else got left behind. Clara adapted without complaint, redistributing their supplies into packs she and Wade could carry. Caleb walked between them, holding Wade's hand on the steep sections, chattering about rocks and birds and occasionally asking if they were almost there. Not yet, buddy, Wade said for the 100th time. But soon? Soon. That night, the 4th night, they made camp in the ruins of an old trapping station that provided actual shelter for the first time since entering the mountains. Families crammed into the collapsed building, sharing body heat, while the cattle were penned in what remained of a corral. Wade was checking on the animals when he heard shouting from the camp. He ran back to find chaos. One of the children, a girl maybe 8 years old, had wandered too close to the cliff edge while playing and fallen. She'd only dropped about 10 feet before catching on a ledge, but the ledge was narrow and crumbling, and everyone was terrified to go after her in case it collapsed entirely. Wade reached the edge and looked down. The girl was conscious but crying, one arm bent at an angle that suggested it was broken. I'm coming down, Wade said. It won't hold your weight, someone argued. Then it better hold long enough for me to grab her. Before anyone could stop him, Wade lowered himself over the edge. The ledge held, barely. He could feel it shifting under him, small rocks breaking loose and tumbling into darkness below. The girl whimpered as he reached her, and Wade forced his voice to stay calm. Hey there. What's your name? Sarah. All right, Sarah. I'm going to pick you up and carry you back up, but you need to hold very still. Can you do that? She nodded, tears streaking through the dust on her face. Wade lifted her as gently as he could, feeling the ledge shift ominously under their combined weight. Above him, people had formed a human chain, hands reaching down. Wade passed Sarah up to the first person, then started climbing himself just as the ledge gave way completely. He caught the cliff face, fingers scrabbling for purchase, boots kicking at rock that crumbled away beneath him. Then multiple hands grabbed his arms and hauled him up and over the edge, and he lay there gasping while his heart tried to pound its way out of his chest. Clara was beside him immediately, hands on his face, checking for injuries. "Are you insane? You could have died." "She would have died," Wade managed. "And if you'd fallen, what would Caleb do? What would—" She stopped herself, but Wade heard what she didn't say. "What would I do?" He reached up and touched her face, not caring who saw. "I'm all right. We're all right." Sarah's mother was crying over her daughter's broken arm, but the girl would live, and that was what mattered. They splinted the arm and gave Sarah some whiskey to dull the pain, and Wade sat with Caleb and explained why sometimes people had to take risks to help others. "Even when it's scary?" Caleb asked. "Especially when it's scary." The fifth day, they reached the pass itself. It was narrower than Wade remembered, a cut through the mountains barely wide enough for cattle to move single file. On both sides, sheer cliffs dropped away into nothing. One misstep would be fatal. They moved slowly, carefully, every person terrified. The cattle sensed the danger and balked, having to be coaxed forward one at a time. It took 6 hours to move the entire herd through a passage that was maybe half a mile long, but they made it. And on the other side, the trail opened up into a descending slope that led toward the northern valley Chen had promised. They were through the worst of it. People celebrated quietly, too exhausted for anything louder. That night they made camp in a sheltered hollow, and for the first time in days, Wade let himself believe they might actually survive this. But at dawn, one of the men on watch shook Wade awake with urgency in his voice. "Riders coming from behind, at least 6 of them." Wade was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle. "Pike? Has to be." Wade looked at the families still sleeping, at the cattle scattered across the slope, at the narrow pass they'd just struggled through. Pike had followed them through the mountains, and now they were trapped between him and an unknown valley with no way to retreat. Chen joined Wade at the edge of camp, scanning the trail behind them. Sure enough, riders were visible in the distance, moving fast. "How'd they get through the pass so quick?" Chen muttered. "They're not bringing cattle or families, just men and horses." Wade felt cold realization settle over him. He waited until we cleared the trail, then followed. Smart. What's he planning? Wade thought about it. Pike was outnumbered. 6 men against 15 families wasn't great odds if it came to actual fighting. But Pike didn't need to win a fight. He just needed to cause enough chaos to scatter the herd, destroy supplies, and leave the families stranded in unfamiliar territory with winter coming. "He's going to stampede the cattle," Wade said suddenly. "Drive them over the cliffs or scatter them so far we can't recover them. Without the herd, we can't survive the winter. Then we stop him before he gets close." Wade looked at the terrain. They were on a slope with limited cover, no defensive positions, families exposed. A firefight here would get people killed, but letting Pike reach the cattle would destroy everything they'd risk to save. "Get the families moving toward that tree line," Wade said, pointing to a stand of pines about 200 yards downslope. "Take the cattle with them, and give me 3 men who can shoot." Chen's eyes narrowed. "What are you planning?" "Buying you time to get everyone to safety." "Wade, just do it." Chen hesitated, then nodded and started organizing the families. Wade turned to find Clara already beside him, holding the rifle he'd taught her to load. "You're not doing this alone," she said. "Clara, you need to go with— Caleb's with the Larsons. They'll watch him, and you need someone who can shoot." She met his eyes steadily. "I may not be good at it, but I can make noise and look threatening from a distance. That counts for something." Wade wanted to argue, wanted to send her away somewhere safe, but there wasn't anywhere safe, and they both knew it. "Stay behind cover," he said finally. "And if shooting starts, aim for the horses, not the riders. Easier target." 3 more men joined them, Cooper, Larson, and a young guy named David, who'd been a hunter before becoming a rancher. They spread out along the ridge overlooking the trail, positioning themselves behind rocks and fallen trees. Pike's group rounded the bend about 10 minutes later. 6 riders, just like the scout had said. Pike in front, looking angry and determined. They pulled up when they saw Wade's group blocking the trail. "You can't stop us, Mercer," Pike shouted. "We're coming through." "No," Wade called back. "You're not." "You planning to shoot me in front of witnesses? That'll get you hanged. You followed armed men through the mountains to attack families trying to relocate. Pretty sure the law won't be on your side if this turns ugly." Pike laughed, but it sounded forced. "I'm not attacking anyone. I'm recovering stolen cattle." We both know that's horseshit. The standoff stretched, neither side willing to make the first move. Then one of Pike's men made a mistake. He tried to circle around the ridge, heading for where the cattle were being moved down slope. Clara saw him first and fired a warning shot that kicked up dust inches from his horse. The horse reared, throwing the rider, and just like that, everything went to hell. Pike's men drew weapons and opened fire. Wade and his group returned fire, and for several chaotic minutes the mountainside echoed with gunshots. Horses screamed, men shouted, rock chips flew as bullets hit stone. Wade fired methodically, not trying for kills but making it impossible for Pike's men to advance. Beside him, Clara reloaded and fired again, hands steady despite her fear. Larson took a bullet to the shoulder but kept shooting. Cooper's rifle jammed and he switched to his pistol. Then David did something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He broke from cover and charged Pike's position while firing, forcing the older man's horse to rear and nearly throw him. The distraction gave Wade time to reposition, getting a clear angle on two of Pike's men who'd been trying to flank them. "Fall back," Pike shouted to his crew. "Fall back!" They retreated up the trail, leaving one man limping from a leg wound. Wade's group held position, ready, in case Pike tried another approach. But Pike must have realized the fight wasn't worth it. He was outnumbered by families who were desperate enough to actually fight back, and he'd already lost the element of surprise. Wade watched Pike and his remaining men disappear back through the pass, and only then did he let himself breathe. Clara was staring at her rifle like she couldn't believe she'd actually used it. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Wade took the weapon from her gently and pulled her close, feeling her heart hammering against his chest. "It's over," he said. "You did good. I've never shot at anyone before." "I know. I could have killed someone." "But you didn't. You just scared them off. That's all we needed." Clara pulled back to look at him, and Wade saw tears mixing with the gun smoke residue on her face. "This is what our life is now? Running and fighting and—" "No," Wade said firmly. "This is what it took to escape. But the valley on the other side, that's where we build something different." He wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. Because if all they'd done was trade one fight for another, then what was the point? They caught up with the rest of the group by afternoon. Chen had gotten everyone safely to the tree line, and the families had already started building temporary shelters. Larson's wife cleaned and bandaged her husband's shoulder. The bullet had gone through clean, missing anything vital. That night they made camp in the trees, and Wade walked the perimeter one last time before trying to sleep. His body ached from 2 weeks of riding and carrying supplies and climbing mountains and fighting. His mind ached from constantly calculating odds and making decisions that could get people killed. He found Clara sitting alone again, wrapped in a blanket, and settled beside her without asking if she wanted company. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. Nothing." She leaned against his shoulder and Wade wrapped an arm around her. "Mostly I'm thinking that I'm tired of being scared." "Yeah, me too. When do we get to stop running and start living?" Wade looked out at the darkness beyond the camp, at the mountains they'd crossed and the valley somewhere ahead that they'd pinned all their hopes on. "Soon," he said. "Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after. But soon." Clara took his hand and held it tight, and they sat there together while the camp settled into sleep around them. And Wade let himself imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to wake up somewhere without fear, to build something that lasted, to be more than just a survivor constantly reacting to the next threat, to have a life worth living instead of just a life worth defending. Tomorrow, they'd reach the valley. Tomorrow they'd find out if everything they'd risked had been worth it. But tonight, sitting here with Clara pressed against his side and his son sleeping safely nearby, Wade felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. And for now, that was enough. The northern valley revealed itself slowly as they descended, like a secret the mountains had been keeping. First came the sound of running water. Not the dangerous rapids they'd crossed higher up, but the steady burble of a creek moving through gentler terrain. Then the smell changed, less rock dust and pine, more grass and earth. And finally, as they cleared the last ridge of trees, the valley opened up before them in a way that made several people stop walking entirely. It was bigger than Chen's maps had suggested, maybe 5 miles across, ringed by protective cliffs that would break the worst winter winds. A creek ran through the center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, splitting into smaller tributaries that created natural irrigation. Meadows stretched in every direction, grass still green despite the season. Stands of cottonwood and aspen marked where the soil ran deep. And in the distance, barely visible, were the ruins of old homesteads, evidence that people had lived here once, before the brutal winters everyone talked about had driven them out. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered beside Wade. He wanted to agree, but years of ranching had trained him to see problems before possibilities. The valley was exposed. No town nearby, no neighbors, no help if things went wrong. The old homesteads suggested previous failures, and they were arriving with barely 2 months before serious winter, not enough time to build proper shelter or stockpile adequate supplies. But Caleb was already running ahead through the grass, whooping with joy at the open space after 2 weeks of narrow mountain trails, and the other children were following him, and Wade realized that possibility had to start somewhere, even if that somewhere looked dangerously close to nowhere. Chen gathered everyone that first evening after they'd set up temporary camps along the creek. 15 families, roughly 40 people total, all exhausted and scared and trying to figure out what came next. "We've got 8 weeks, maybe 10 if we're lucky, before the heavy snow," Chen said. "That's not enough time to build individual homesteads for everyone. So here's what I'm thinking. We build one large structure first, something that can house all of us through the winter, keep us warm and dry and alive. Come spring, we spread out and build permanent homes." A woman named Ruth spoke up. "You're talking about living all together, under one roof?" "I'm talking about surviving," Chen said bluntly. "We can worry about privacy and personal space after we make it through winter. Right now we need shelter, and we need it fast." The group debated for an hour, some people uncomfortable with the idea of communal living, others arguing they didn't have enough resources to do anything else. Finally, they agreed to Chen's plan, mostly because nobody had a better alternative. The next morning, they started building. Wade had helped build barns before, but never anything on this scale. They used timber from the surrounding forest, stone from the creek bed, and clay dug from deposits near the old homesteads. The structure took shape slowly, a long building with a central common area for cooking and gathering, flanked by smaller rooms that would provide some measure of privacy for families. Everyone worked. Men felled trees and hauled stone. Women mixed clay and prepared meals. Children carried water and gathered kindling. Even Caleb helped, dragging branches too big for him to lift properly, determined to contribute. Clara worked alongside the other women, and Wade watched her transform over those first weeks. She'd spent 2 years in Blackthorn Ridge being invisible, keeping her head down, apologizing for existing. Here, with everyone equally desperate and equally committed, she stopped apologizing, started offering opinions in planning meetings, organized the children into work crews that actually accomplished things, became someone people listened to not because of her status, she had none, but because her ideas made sense. Wade fell in love with her all over again watching that happen. Not that he said anything. There was too much work to do, too much survival requiring attention, too many ways things could still fall apart. But he felt it, constant and undeniable, every time she smiled at him across the construction site, or sat beside him at the evening fires, or woke up in the morning with her hair a mess and dirt under her fingernails and didn't seem to care. 3 weeks into construction, Wade was working on the roof when he heard shouting from the valley entrance. He climbed down fast, grabbing his rifle, expecting pike or more trouble from the old valley. Instead, he found strangers, 3 wagons worth of families, looking travel-worn and desperate. Chen met them first, and Wade arrived in time to hear the lead man explaining. "We're from Blackthorn Ridge. Well, we were. Pike's been making life impossible for anyone who won't sell to him at pennies on the dollar. Heard rumors that some families made it through the pass to a valley up north. We took a chance that the rumors were true." "How many more are coming?" Chen asked. "Chen, don't know. Maybe a dozen families talked about trying, but the pass..." The man shook his head. "It's getting rougher. Snow's already accumulating at the higher elevations. We might be the last ones who can make it through before spring. They absorbed the new families into the work crews, which meant more hands, but also more mouths to feed. The building expanded to accommodate the extra people. Hunting parties went out more frequently, bringing back deer and elk that women preserved using salt and smoke. Every day was a race against approaching winter, and every night Wade fell asleep too exhausted to dream. One evening, in late October, Wade was checking on the cattle when Clara found him. She looked troubled, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm coat someone had sewn for her from deer hide. "What's wrong?" Wade asked. "Nothing's wrong exactly, just—" She gestured back toward the building where lamplight glowed from windows they'd installed that afternoon. "This is working. The building, the cooperation, all of it. People are actually doing it. That's good, isn't it?" "It's terrifying," Clara said, "because now I have something to lose again. For 2 years I didn't care if I lived or died. Didn't matter. But now it matters, and that makes everything more frightening." Wade understood exactly what she meant. He'd spent 3 years after Margaret's death in emotional isolation specifically so he wouldn't have to risk feeling loss again. Now he was surrounded by people he cared about. Caleb, Clara, the families they'd traveled with, even strangers like Cooper who'd become friends. And the possibility of losing any of them was almost unbearable. "I think that's what living actually is," Wade said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. "Not the absence of fear, but caring about something enough that fear becomes worthwhile." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then stepped closer and kissed him. It wasn't their first kiss. They'd shared a brief, desperate one during the mountain crossing. But this was different, slower, more deliberate, less about survival and more about choice. When they separated, Clara was smiling in a way Wade hadn't seen before. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," she admitted. "Yeah? But I didn't know if you were ready. If you'd feel guilty about, Margaret," Wade finished. He took Clara's hands. "I love my wife. Still do, in the way you love someone who shaped who you are. But she's gone, and I'm not. And I think she'd be angry if I spent the rest of my life refusing to feel anything just because she couldn't be here to feel it with me." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears. "You sure?" "More sure than I've been about anything in years." They kissed again, and this time Wade let himself fully feel it without guilt, without reservation, without the ghost of his past trying to convince him this was betrayal. It wasn't betrayal. It was healing. They walked back to the building hand in hand, and if anyone noticed, they didn't comment. There were bigger concerns demanding attention, like the fact that the first serious snowfall hit 2 days later, a week earlier than anyone had hoped. The building wasn't finished. They'd completed the main structure in most of the rooms, but several sections still needed proper roofing, and the chimney for the central fireplace wasn't drawing correctly. They worked frantically through the snowfall, trying to seal gaps and finish critical sections before the temperature dropped too far. By the 3rd day of continuous snow, they'd done enough that everyone could move inside, cramped and uncomfortable, but protected from the weather. 47 people, the original 15 families, plus the 3 who'd arrived from Blackthorn Ridge, living in a space designed for maybe 30. The first week was chaos. Children cried from being cooped up. Adults snapped at each other over minor annoyances. The inadequate chimney filled rooms with smoke until Cooper figured out how to redirect the draft. Food ran low because they'd burned through supplies faster than anticipated during the building rush. Wade found himself mediating disputes constantly. Who got space near the fire? Who was responsible for cleaning which areas? Whose children were causing problems? He'd never wanted to be a leader, had actively avoided that role his entire life, but somehow people kept turning to him for decisions. One night, lying in the small room he shared with Caleb and Clara, because yes, they'd stopped pretending they weren't together, and yes, the church ladies from back home would have had collective heart attacks, but nobody here seemed to care. Wade expressed his frustration. "I'm not qualified for this," he said. "I'm a rancher. I know cattle and fences and how to fix a wagon wheel. I don't know how to run a community." Clara was mending a torn shirt by candlelight. Nobody knows how to run a community until they do it, and people trust you because you don't want the power. That makes you safer than someone who does. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. Vernon Pike wanted power, used it to control and exploit. You just want everyone to survive, and people can tell the difference. Caleb, already half asleep, mumbled something that might have been agreement before rolling over. Wade looked at the two of them, this accidental family he'd somehow acquired, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier. Not just for them, but for all 47 people depending on decisions he was barely qualified to make. But Clara was right. Nobody knew how to do this. They were all just trying their best and hoping it was enough. 2 weeks later, a group of men from Blackthorn Ridge arrived at the valley entrance on foot, nearly dead from cold and exposure. They'd abandoned their horses when the trail became impassable, then pushed through on determination alone. 7 men total, including Tom Bellamy from the general store and 2 of the ranchers who'd originally attended Chen's meeting but backed out at the last minute. Wade brought them inside and got them warm while Chen organized food and medical attention. Once they'd recovered enough to talk, Tom explained why they'd come. "Blackthorn Ridge is dying," he said bluntly. "After you all left, Pike tried to consolidate everything under his control. Bought up properties for nothing, forced families out, eliminated any competition, thought he'd become king of the territory." Tom laughed bitterly. "Instead, he killed the town. Without small ranchers buying supplies, without families supporting the businesses, without any cooperation or community, everything collapsed. The store's empty because I can't get goods without credit. The saloon closed. Families are leaving every week. Why push it but down." "Why are you telling us this?" Chen asked. "Because Pikes finally realized he destroyed the thing he was trying to control. And now he's desperate." Tom looked at Wade. "He's planning to come here. Soon as the pass clears in spring, he's going to try to take this valley by force, claim it was his by right of prior exploration or some legal nonsense, and drive you all out." The room went silent. Finally, Wade spoke. "How many men can he bring?" "Maybe 20 if he hires guns from outside the territory. More if he convinces people they're defending property rights instead of just helping a bitter man take revenge." "We've got maybe 15 men who can fight," Chen said, "and half of them aren't soldiers. We're ranchers and farmers." "So were the people who settled this territory originally," Tom pointed out. "Sometimes being willing to defend something is more important than knowing how." They debated long into the night. Some argued they should leave, find somewhere even more remote. Others insisted they'd already run far enough. A few wanted to try negotiating with Pike, though nobody believed that would work. Wade listened to it all and thought about what they'd built here. It wasn't much yet. 1 building, barely enough supplies, a community still figuring out how to function. But it was theirs, built through cooperation instead of coercion, and everyone here had already proven they'd rather risk death than live under Pike's system. "We stay," Wade said when the debate died down, "and we prepare." The winter passed slowly, 47 people learning to live in close quarters, to share limited resources, to resolve conflicts without violence because there was nowhere to escape each other. Children adapted fastest, forming friendships across family lines, creating games that worked in confined spaces. Adults struggled more, but gradually they found rhythms that worked. Clara organized a school, teaching children reading and arithmetic using slates and chalk they'd brought from the old valley. Cooper started training anyone interested in basic defense tactics, not because they expected to become soldiers, but because knowing how to handle weapons competently reduced accidents. Wade and Chen planned crop rotations for spring, identifying which fields would be best for wheat, corn, vegetables. And slowly, painfully, the collection of desperate refugees began transforming into something that resembled an actual community. One evening in January, during a blizzard that made the building shake, Wade found himself sitting near the central fire with Clara on one side and Caleb on the other. Around them, other families gathered in small groups, sharing stories, playing cards, arguing about nothing important. Someone was playing a fiddle badly in the corner. Children were laughing. It was loud and chaotic, and nothing like the quiet isolation Wade had lived in for 3 years after Margaret died. And it was exactly what he needed. "You look happy," Clara observed quietly. Wade considered that. "I look tired." "That too, but also happy." She was right. Despite everything, despite Pike's looming threat and the brutal winter and the constant challenges of making this valley work, Wade was happy in a way he'd forgotten was possible. "We should get married," he said suddenly. Clara choked on the water she'd been drinking. "What?" "I mean," Wade felt his face heat. This was not how he'd planned to propose, assuming he'd planned to propose at all. "Not right now, But eventually, when things are more stable, if you want to, you don't have to. Clara kissed him quiet, then pulled back with a smile that transformed her whole face. Yes. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you when things are stable, which they probably never will be, so maybe we should just do it anyway. Caleb looked up from the drawing he'd been working on. Does this mean Clara's going to be my new mama? Wade glanced at Clara, uncertain how to answer that, but Clara handled it perfectly. I can't replace your mama, she said to Caleb. She was special and important, and you should never forget her. But I can love you and take care of you if you'll let me. Would that be all right? Caleb thought about it seriously, then nodded. Yeah, that'd be good. And just like that, Wade's accidental family became official. They married 3 weeks later in a ceremony conducted by Tom Bellamy, who'd apparently been ordained years ago and still remembered enough words to make it legal. The entire community attended because there wasn't anywhere else to be, and afterward people shared food and someone played that terrible fiddle and children danced in ways that barely resembled dancing. That night, in their small room with Caleb finally asleep after too much excitement, Clara lay in Wade's arms and whispered, "Do you think we'll survive what's coming with Pike?" I don't know, Wade admitted, but I know we've got a better chance together than any of us had alone in that old valley. That's not very reassuring. It's honest, Clara laughed quietly. I suppose I should be used to your brutal honesty by now. Probably. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and Wade's last thought before unconsciousness took him was that regardless of what happened in spring, at least he'd stopped just surviving and started actually living. The snow began melting in late March, earlier than expected, which meant the pass would clear sooner, and Pike would come sooner, and they had less time to prepare than they'd hoped. Chen organized training intensively. Everyone who could hold a weapon learned basic competency. They reinforced the building's weak points, stockpiled ammunition, planned defensive positions around the valley. Cooper scouted the pass approaches, identifying places where a small force could slow down a larger one. And they sent riders to nearby territories, asking for help from other small ranchers who might see Pike's aggression as a threat to their own independence. 2 groups responded. 8 men from a settlement 50 miles east who'd heard about the valley and wanted to support what they were building. And 5 families from a failed mining camp who'd been looking for somewhere to relocate anyway and figured defending the valley was better than searching elsewhere. That brought their numbers to roughly 30 men capable of fighting, plus another 20 who could help with logistics, medical care, and protecting the non-combatants. Not great odds against Pike's potential 20-plus hired guns, but better than they'd had a month ago. The pass cleared in mid-April. Pike arrived 3 days later. Wade was on watch when he saw them coming, a long line of riders moving through the valley entrance in formation that suggested military experience. He counted 23 men, all armed, moving with purpose. Wade fired the signal shot that alerted everyone to danger, then rode hard back to the building where Chen was already organizing defensive positions. Women and children moved into the interior rooms, away from windows. Men took positions behind reinforced barriers they'd built specifically for this scenario. Wade positioned himself near the main entrance with Clara behind him, reloading weapons as needed. "You should be in the back with Caleb," Wade said. "I should be here helping you," Clara replied. "Caleb's with Ruth and the other children. He'll be fine." Wade wanted to argue but didn't have time. Pike's force had reached speaking distance and stopped just outside rifle range. Vernon Pike rode forward alone, looking older and harder than Wade remembered. The brutal winter enforcing his control over a dying town had worn him down in visible ways. "Wade Mercer," Pike called out. "Still making poor decisions, I see. Go back to Blackthorn Ridge, Pike. You've got no business here. This valley belongs to whoever can hold it. I'm here to take possession." "You're here to steal what other people built. That's what you've always done." Pike's face darkened. "I built that town from nothing, made it prosperous, created opportunities. And you ungrateful bastards destroyed it by running away instead of working within the system I created." "Your system was exploitation," Chen shouted from inside the building. "You didn't create opportunity. You hoarded it and sold it back to desperate people at whatever price you named. That's called business. That's called tyranny," Wade said. "And we're done living under it." Pike looked at the building, at the defensive positions, at the 30-plus men clearly ready to fight. Wade saw the calculation happening in Pike's eyes. Was this worth the cost? "Last chance," Pike called out. Surrender the valley peacefully, and I'll let everyone leave alive. Fight, and I'll burn that building with your families inside. Wade felt Clara's hand on his back, steady and sure. He thought about Margaret and how she'd always believed people were better than their worst impulses. About Caleb learning that standing up to bullies was worthwhile even when it was dangerous. About the 47 people who'd trusted him to lead them somewhere better. No, Wade said simply. Pike's expression twisted into something ugly. You're all going to die for a patch of dirt in the middle of nowhere. We're going to fight for the right to build something without you controlling it. If that gets us killed, at least we died for something that mattered. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Pike raised his hand to signal the attack. But before he could drop it, something unexpected happened. 3 of Pike's men dismounted and walked away from the group, heading back toward the pass. Pike turned on them furiously. Where the hell do you think you're going? This ain't what we signed up for, one of them called back. You said we were defending property rights. This is just revenge. I'm paying you to follow orders. Not enough to kill families. Find someone else. They kept walking, and Pike's face went purple with rage. But the damage was done. Other men in his crew were looking uncertain now, questioning whether this was worth dying for. Wade seized the moment. Anyone else who wants to leave, now's your chance. No judgment. But anyone who stays is choosing to start a war, and we will defend ourselves. 5 more men dismounted and followed the first 3. Pike was left with 15 riders, and his control over the situation was visibly crumbling. But instead of backing down, his desperation made him reckless. Fine, Pike snarled. We do this the hard way. He spurred his horse forward, and his remaining men followed. The fight that followed was brief and chaotic, and nothing like the clean battles Wade had heard about in war stories. It was mostly noise and smoke and confusion, people shooting at movement and hoping they hit enemies instead of friends. Wade fired until his rifle overheated. Clara reloaded faster than he thought possible, hands steady despite the chaos. From inside the building, other men fired through windows and gaps in the barriers. Pike's men tried to flank but ran into the defensive positions Cooper had set up, taking fire from multiple angles. The turning point came when one of Pike's hired guns took a bullet to the leg and started screaming. The sound was awful, raw and terrified, and nothing like the stoic heroism people imagined combat involved. Several of Pike's other men heard it and lost their nerve, pulling back despite Pike's orders to advance. And then Pike himself took a bullet, not from Wade, but from one of the defenders in the building. It caught him in the shoulder, spinning him partly around in his saddle. His horse reared and Pike fell, hitting the ground hard. His remaining men broke completely then, scattering in different directions, some helping their wounded, others just running. Wade moved forward cautiously, rifle ready, and found Pike trying to crawl toward his horse with one arm clearly useless. The older man looked up at Wade with eyes full of fury and pain and something that might have been fear. Finish it, Pike rasped. You won, so finish it. Wade stood over him, rifle pointed, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no triumph. Just exhaustion and a desperate wish that this could have been resolved without violence. No, Wade said. You're going to live. You're going to go back to what's left of Blackthorn Ridge and tell everyone what happened here. Tell them we didn't surrender and we didn't run, and we built something better than what you tried to force on us. Chen appeared beside Wade, along with Cooper and Tom Bellamy. They looked at Pike with expressions ranging from contempt to pity. Get him bandaged, Wade said, then put him on a horse and send him home. They did, and within an hour Pike and his remaining men were riding back through the pass, defeated not by superior force, but by people who'd simply refused to be controlled anymore. The Valley defenders had taken casualties too. 2 men wounded seriously enough that they'd need weeks of recovery. Several others with minor injuries. And everyone shaken by how close they'd come to something much worse. That night, the entire community gathered in the building to process what had happened. Some people cried. Others sat in stunned silence. Children asked questions adults struggled to answer. Wade stood in front of them all and didn't try to make a speech about victory or justice. He just spoke honestly. What happened today was ugly. Violence always is, but it was necessary, and we'll carry that weight together. Pike tried to take our freedom to build lives on our own terms, and we refused to let him. That's what we defended, not land, not property, our right to exist without someone else's boot on our necks. Clara squeezed his hand, and Caleb leaned against his side. and Wade felt the truth of what they'd created here settle into his bones. They'd survived. Spring turned to summer, and the valley transformed. They planted crops that grew strong in the good soil, built individual homes for families who'd lived communally through necessity, but now had space to spread out. Welcomed more families fleeing Pike's influence until their numbers reached 70 people across 23 households. News arrived through traders that Blackthorn Ridge had effectively ceased to exist. Pike had disappeared. Some said he'd died from his wounds, others claimed he'd moved to a different territory, and without his controlling presence, the town had scattered, people relocating to places that felt less poisoned by recent history. Tom Bellamy stayed in the valley and opened a small trading post. Cooper built a house near Wade's property and started raising horses. Chen became the unofficial mayor of what people started calling Mercer Valley, though Wade tried to argue that was a terrible name and they should pick something else. "You led us here," Chen said. "You defended us. You earned it." "I didn't do it alone." "No. But you started it when you hired Clara and refused to apologize for treating her with basic human dignity. That's what began all this, one person refusing to accept cruelty as normal." Wade didn't know what to say to that, so he just accepted the name and tried not to feel too self-conscious about it. One evening in late June, Wade sat on the porch of the new house he'd built with Caleb's help, bigger than the old ranch, with enough room for the family he and Clara were building. Clara was inside cooking dinner, occasionally singing to herself in a way that made Wade smile. Caleb was in the yard showing some of the younger children how to identify different kinds of rocks. Wade thought about Margaret and how she would have loved this place, how she would have adopted half the families in the valley and organized quilting circles and found ways to help everyone thrive. He still missed her, probably always would, but the grief had transformed into something softer now. Less a wound, more a memory of someone who'd shaped him into the kind of person capable of building this life. Clara came out and settled beside him, one hand resting on her stomach where their child was just beginning to show. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How I almost didn't speak to you that day outside the trading post. How I almost listened to everyone telling me that helping you was inappropriate or dangerous or foolish." "But you didn't." "No. Caleb said you looked lonely, and I couldn't pretend I didn't see it too." Wade took her hand. One honest observation from a 6-year-old changed everything. Clara smiled. Children are good at seeing truth before the world teaches them to look away. They sat together watching the sun set behind the mountains they'd crossed months ago, and Wade thought about the people he'd become connected to, the families who'd trusted him to lead them somewhere better, the men and women who'd fought beside him, the children growing up in a place where cooperation mattered more than domination. It wasn't perfect. They'd face more hardships, droughts, harsh winters, illnesses, all the challenges that came with frontier life. But they'd face them together, and that made all the difference. Caleb ran up to the porch, holding another rock. "Papa, look. This one's got red streaks." Wade examined it seriously. "That's probably iron oxide. Good find. Can I keep it?" "It's your rock. You found it." Caleb beamed and ran back to show his collection to his friends, and Wade felt Clara lean against his shoulder. "He's happy here," she said. "Really happy." "So am I." Even with everything we went through, the fear and the fighting and almost dying in those mountains, Wade thought about it honestly. "I think I needed to go through all that, needed to learn that staying safe and isolated wasn't the same as being alive. Margaret's death taught me to survive alone. You taught me how to live with other people again." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's true." She kissed him, soft and slow, and Wade let himself fully exist in that moment without guilt or fear or the weight of the past crushing down. The valley around them hummed with life. Children playing, adults calling to each other as they finished evening chores, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the creek running steady and sure through land that would support them as long as they worked together to protect it. Wade Mercer had spent 3 years learning that strength meant enduring loss alone. But sitting here with his wife and his son and the community they'd fought to create, he finally understood that real strength was letting yourself care about things despite knowing you could lose them. It was choosing connection over isolation, vulnerability over invulnerability, messy, complicated love over the false safety of emotional distance. It was admitting that one person noticing another person's loneliness could start a chain reaction that changed everything for dozens of families and challenged systems that had seemed immovable. It was proving that compassion wasn't weakness, and that standing up to cruelty was always worth the cost, even when the cost was terrifyingly high. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Lanterns began glowing in windows across the settlement. Someone started playing that terrible fiddle again, and instead of being annoying, it felt like home. Clara rested her head on Wade's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat there together while darkness gathered and stars emerged overhead. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever, Wade felt certain about the future. Not certain it would be easy. Not certain they wouldn't face more challenges and heartbreak and situations that tested everything they'd built. But certain that whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that made all the difference in the world.